Welcome to In the Word, a study of the International Bible School lesson. Join Dr. Lee Magnus, Professor Emeritus of Bible, and Dr. Bill Gwaltney, Professor Emeritus of Bible, both from Milligan College, as they bring you their thoughts and knowledge of the study of the Sunday school lesson for the day. Now, here is Dr. Gwaltney.
It is our personal joy, Dr. Magnus and I, to be with you and to join you in the Word this morning. It is really a pleasure to be with you. And we are talking about covenant as we find it in the Old Testament. And so we just want to begin by mentioning the fact that there is more than one. There are several different covenants mentioned in the Old Testament. Lee, why don't we say a word, first of all, list them and then say a word about them.
Well, the word covenant is first used in reference to Noah and the flood experience that we're very familiar with.
Yes.
But the concept of covenant actually goes back into God's relationship with the first humans, with Adam and Eve.
Even in chapter 1 of Genesis, we have the spelling out of the relationship. Now, and that's the important thing about covenant, isn't it?
Yeah.
It is a way in which two can join together in a meaningful relationship. It goes beyond being a contract.
Right, and that relationship involves mutual responsibilities in this new creation
and
here.
A few restrictions.
And restrictions, yes.
We learn in chapter 2.
Yeah, and that's characteristic of a covenant relationship.
So can we say that the first covenant that we mark in the Old Testament is right at the very beginning and given to the world through Adam?
Okay, we can call that covenant number 1 with Adam.
With Adam,
yeah.
Okay. And the next covenant that we find is the one that we have been talking about in past weeks with Noah.
Right.
Now, how is that? Now, that's where the word covenant first appears.
Covenant first appears in Genesis chapter 6, and there, Noah is blessed by God with rescue, but also given responsibilities by God for the building of the ark.
Yes, at the end, however, after he has come off the ark, and then it's like humanity restarts, begins again.
Right. He worships God, builds an altar and worships God.
Yes.
And then we get this idea of kind of repopulating the earth.
The same words that we have in Genesis 1.
Right. So it's kind of like the covenant with Adam gets reconstituted with Noah.
Yes.
And but at any rate,
But there's another thing that gets reconstituted.
Sin.
Well, yes. and I don't know if you noticed it or not, but in both cases where there is human failure, nakedness is the way in which it's communicated. They were naked, and then they were aware. Who told you were naked?
You were aware of nakedness.
In Adam's case,
there was shame.
Shame, and then Noah gets drunk on wine and is lying around naked. And there's a very important part of the story where the children cover his nakedness.
Right.
And have to cover his shame.
Right. Yeah.
So, in other words, the problem that humans pose for the creation reappears in the story of Noah. But after that, there is a covenant made, and we know the sign of the covenant is the rainbow, and this is a universal covenant for everyone.
Things really take a shift in Genesis chapter 12, where God focuses his attention on one person, Abraham, and works through Abraham's family and descendants, and that's the third covenant.
There's our third covenant
with Abraham,
and it is more specific and it is limited. And Abraham is chosen. We're not told by the text why he is chosen, why God picks him, but God does.
And there we have, as you say, limited features. There's going to be a specific family one son, although many descendants. There's going to be one land in which they live. But the purpose of that people is not just chosen to be blessed, they are chosen to be a blessing. So
Yes.
the covenant works both ways. There is responsibility and accountability as usual.
And there are 4 versions with Abraham, just
Yes.
in order to emphasize the overriding importance of this particular covenant.
Right.
Now we come to where we are in our lessons for today.
Yeah, and we talked last week too about this as well, and this is the covenant relationship with all Israel through Moses.
Yeah.
And the giving of the law, and we're going to have our lesson today is going to focus on the law.
Now what happens with the passage of time is that families reproduce, and you get the 3rd, 4th, 5th cousins. I have one cousin in my family. It refers to our relationship as being 23rd cousins. It's really not, we're really closer than that, but not
Feels
much.
that far away, huh?
You're right.
Well, in a future lesson, we're going to jump to God's covenant relationship with David.
Now we get more specific again. In other words, the covenant relationship broadens to the entire people with the covenant
Through
Moses. And now we are going to focus. We're going to focus on one individual and his particular line, and we'll have a lesson coming up on that.
Now, you discovered another variation of the covenant with the Israelites later on in the prophetic writings.
Yes.
And what's
that? After the Babylonian captivity, and when the Jewish people, and you can use the word Jew when you get to this time period, we're in the 500s. So it's many centuries later, where God has allowed them to come back, led them back, and they reestablish and rebuild the temple. And then there is a covenant that God administers through 2 prophets, Haggai and Zechariah, to the Levites and to the priestly family.
We're calling this the 6th covenant with the priesthood of Israel.
Yes.
With the priesthood.
And then the one that we would end with as number 7 is the expectation of a future covenant, and we would call it the new covenant, based on Jeremiah chapter 31, verse 31.
Right, the promise of a new covenant, and that, of course, becomes a springboard into the New Testament, where the word New Testament actually means new covenant.
Yes.
Yeah. So good. Well, thanks for that review. That's helpful.
And so we would invite our viewers to keep these 7 different covenants in mind. They all have a commonality, a thing that you find in all of them, in each one of them.
Because they're covenants. Yeah.
Because they're covenants, and because God is a God of peace and love and relationship.
Yeah.
And that's what the covenant accomplishes.
Well, let's continue with our study of the story of the Mount Sinai experience. We were there last week, and we're there again this week in Exodus chapter 20. Now, what's in the immediate background in the first 17 verses is the giving of the 10 Commandments, which we're skipping over and not discussing here. What we're reading today is the immediate aftermath of the giving of the 10 Commandments.
The interesting thing is they are not called the 10 Commandments in the Bible. They are called the 10 words.
Okay.
And by word is meant something, it's not like, well, pick a word, like basket or hoop or whatever. It's not word in that sense. It's a word in the sense of a principle, a concept, a juridical principle that is contained within a collection of words.
Okay.
And so the 10 words are I like to use the term pronouncement. And that's what it's called in later Jewish literature, the 10 pronouncements.
Okay.
Okay,
Well, this is the reaction, the response to the 10 pronouncements then, right?
right.
Good.
Very good.
Well, shall I read this?
Why
passage
don't you
here?
read
Yeah.
this morning?
We'll start in Exodus 20, verse 18. When the people saw the thunder and lightning and heard the trumpet and saw the mountain in smoke, they trembled with fear. They stayed at a distance and said to Moses, "Speak to us yourself and we will listen, but do not have God speak to us or we will die." Moses said to the people, "Don't be afraid. God has come to test you so that the fear of God will be with you, to keep you from sinning." The people remained at a distance while Moses approached the thick darkness where God was. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Tell the Israelites this: You have seen for yourselves that I have spoken to you from heaven. Do not make any gods to be alongside me. Do not make for yourselves gods of silver or gods of gold. Make an altar of earth for me and sacrifice on it your burnt offerings and fellowship offerings, your sheep and goats and your cattle. Wherever I cause my name to be honored, I will come to you and bless you. If you make an altar of stones for me, don't build it with dressed stones, for you will defile it if you use a tool on it. And don't go up to my altar on steps, or your private parts may be exposed."
And on that cheering
Slightly
note,
odd way to end the
that's
text.
the end of chapter 20.
But, well, we'll come back and talk about that.
We'll talk about that.
Let's talk about some of the more crucial things.
Well, there are several comments I would like to make about just the wording of the text. In verse 18, they trembled, and this verb that is used marks where everything is shaking, sort of like a shudder under an earthquake.
Well, we've seen this before in this Exodus text, and two things are shaking in this Mount Sinai experience. The mountain is shaking.
Yes.
And then the people are also shaking.
Yes, exactly.
Yes, as well.
For fear is actually not in the text.
Okay.
And then moving over to verse 19.
Yeah, before we leave 18, I wanted
Okay.
to mention one quick thing, just a matter of interest. There are three distinct senses appealed to in this passage. First, there's sight, right? They saw the thunder and lightning.
How do you see thunder?
Okay, second, there's hearing.
Yes.
Okay, smart Alec. They heard the thunder and the trumpet, our shofar that we were talking about last week.
Right.
But then the third is the sense of smell, because of the smoke. Yeah,
And,
I'm sure they saw it and smelled it. So three of the senses are appealed to there.
Isn't it interesting?
Yeah. Okay. On to 19.
Now, on the 19, speak to yourself and we will listen. The title of this lesson is Obeying God's Law. The verb to obey appears not to be in our text at all, but it really is. In this wording, where the NIV, I'm not sure what the King James has, we will listen. There's an idiom which uses the verb to hear with a preposition that follows it. To hearken to is, I think, the way King James would word this. To hearken to means to obey.
Okay, like to give heed to something.
To act on
Well,
what
and
you hear.
we use that idiom too. We can use the word listen either to mean hear what I'm saying or hear and do.
Do what I say.
Listen to me now.
Yeah. Now, again, let's remind ourselves of what law is, what the word Torah really means. We mentioned this earlier. And the word really means instruction.
Yeah.
It comes from a root in Hebrew to throw down, like to throw down foundations of a building or of a city. And when it's put in other forms, it means to teach. to instruct. So a better rendering of the word would be instruction. And generally in their culture, the instruction would come from priestly type individuals. You go to the priest for an instruction as to your health and what you do for your health and what is the proper kind of action to take in a particular situation.
That's a helpful concept because these laws, as we often call them, are actually the foundation that God is laying down for covenant living.
Exactly.
And that's a good concept.
Now in verse 20.
Verse 20 is very interesting to me because it has two uses.
I have one more comment on this 19.
Okay.
The way the NIV makes it sound, do not have God speak to us. I think this is not a very good rendering of the text. It makes it sound like Moses can tell God, don't you do this. It is not Moses who is the subject of the verb, but it is God who's the subject of the verb. Let not God, this is a wish that they are expressing. Let not God speak to us because we cannot stand hearing the voice of God.
Directly from God.
Yeah, so you go, be the intermediary, you hear the words of God and come and tell us what God said.
But they're not telling Moses to tell God what to do. That's
exactly.
good. Now verse 20 is so interesting because we have two references to fear, and it seems a little bit opposite. First it says, don't be afraid, fear not.
Okay, and we learned previously that is the introduction of an oracle of good news.
Yeah, consolation, encouragement.
Encouragement, this is good.
But then it goes on to say, don't be afraid, God has come to test you so that the fear of God will be with you.
So don't be afraid, but
so which
fear.
is it? Yeah, don't be afraid, but fear. Let's make sure folks are comfortable with that apparent contradiction there. How come they're not supposed to be afraid, but they are supposed to be afraid?
Because it's a good thing. It's a good oracle. The word from God is going to be very good and very positive. And so don't be afraid of what God is going to tell you. He's not going to beat you up either physically or with words. So it's good news that's coming.
Okay, that's the fear not. Now,
fear not.
What about the fear of God?
Fear is used frequently, very frequently in both Old and New Testament to mean show proper reverence for. And so respect, the highest level of respect is due to God who is almighty and has all the power. So show respect for God, show the highest degree of respect for God.
Yeah, and you're right. This is all through the New Testament as well. I think of some of the miracles of Jesus where like they're afraid of the storm. Jesus tells them not to be afraid of the storm, and he stills the storm, and then they're afraid. Well, that's appropriate. That they have reverence.
Fear.
They have reverence for
reverence,
Jesus, who has just done that. And at the end of Mark, the women leave the empty tomb in fear. That's appropriate. They're not going to run and hide. They're going to run and proclaim.
Yes.
Because they are in awe of what God has just done through Jesus Christ.
I'm afraid the word awesome has been taken over.
It's been trivialized, hasn't it?
That's a good way to put it.
It has.
Very good way, yes.
But awesome is a good word. Well, that verse 20 is just... Now, here's part of the covenant responsibility here. Fear of God will be with you. Why? To keep you from sinning. And we talked about how even after making covenant with Adam and after making covenant with Noah, both covenant parties sinned, and here we see the possibility again.
Look at what's happening in our country. You trivialize God, and what is happening?
When there's no true fear of God or awe of God, there's nothing to keep us from sinning.
That's right.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I mean, We see it every day.
Yeah. By the way, this
unfortunately.
verse 20, which I think is so rich, also emphasizes God's covenant desire to be present to his people.
Yes.
The fear of God will be with you.
Yes.
The emphasis on presence there.
Well, now we move into verses 22 and 23. And the interesting thing is that the verbs here are all in the plural, where God, Yahweh, the Lord, said to Moses, tell the Israelites this. Now, all these verbs that follow in these two verses are speaking in the plural as if Israel is being singled out individually. And this is true for every one of you. Every one of you has seen for yourselves that I've spoken to you all from heaven. And now, consequently, do not make any, have any other gods with me. Mm-hmm. Do not make for yourselves gods of silver or gold.
Yeah.
And here are the first two commandments.
They are.
Out of the first part of the chapter.
Verse 23 repeats commandment number 1 and commandment number 2.
Right.
In Deuteronomy, this whole Sinai experience and the giving of the law is retold by Moses to the younger generation shortly before his death and their passage over into the promised land. And in that account, there's an interesting little addition in the words of Moses that appears in Deuteronomy chapter 4. Let me just read a couple of verses. Verse 12, then the Lord spoke to you out of the fire. We've seen that. You heard the sound of words, but saw no form. And then he goes on and talks about covenant. And I think that's implied here, but not actually stated. It is stated in Deuteronomy.
Now, the difference between Moses and the Israelite people here is that the Israelite people had heard the voice of God and it was frightening to them. Mm-hmm. So they asked that and pled with God to speak with Moses and have Moses then come and tell them the word.
Right.
But Moses then was in a position not only to hear the word of God, mm-hmm. but also to see God. Well,
that's one of the distinctions here. I think the other distinction is between the Israelites' experience of God and the pagan experience of God, where they are imagining their gods in forms that they can then carve and create in what we know of as idolatry.
So, now, this second one, we should understand that God is saying, don't make any kind of representation of any God, including me.
Right.
So that's a very important part of it. Now, the verbs change when we get to verse 24. And here the verbs are all expressed in the singular.
So every time we see the word you, it's you singular.
Yes.
And that would put the emphasis on each individual Israelite.
Well, in a way, but it also puts the emphasis upon them as a group.
It puts them all together as one single entity.
It's a mm-hmm. singular, meaning you as a group. So they have been addressed individually. Now they're being addressed corporately. Mm-hmm. And
well, verse 24, beyond that change, verse 24 is so interesting because it talks about their actual process of worship, which is going to be expanded on and described in even greater detail as the law unfolds in Exodus and Leviticus.
Yes.
And here we see instructions for the building of an altar. Now, this is not the first time It's not that they've never had altars before.
Correct.
Abraham built an altar and sacrificed to God on it.
And we even have now, through archaeology, the recovery of various kinds of altars. And we even have a type of sanctuary that's an open-air sanctuary referred to in the Old Testament as a so-called high place.
Okay. So here's an altar that they're building. Now, it differentiates two kinds of sacrifices. Why don't you quickly help us understand the difference between a burnt offering and a fellowship offering?
Well, the burnt offering is an offering of the total animal. And the word means to go up, which means in burning it on the altar, you make it so that no human can participate in it.
So
it is devoted to God.
The whole thing is burnt up.
And now what
And
we
a
have,
fellowship offering.
now that is in some Bibles called whole burnt offerings, because the word it means completely. But I don't think it's completely in sense of all of it being burned, because it's described in Leviticus, the early part of Leviticus, as a kind of a communion meal. That's why they're calling it fellowship offering in the NIV translation. It means when you come to worship God, you bring an animal plus vegetables plus drink, and you then present that to the priest. The priest has a prayer over it, and it is butchered. Part of the animal is laid on the altar to be burned. That's God's part. Part of it is taken by the priest and his family to be eaten. That is the clergy's part. And part of it is returned to the worshiper, who then prepares it as a meal and then eat. In other words, it is sort of like an early forerunner of communion.
A communal meal.
The meal,
as part of a sacrifice to
well,
God.
it joins the divinity, the clergy, and the worshiper in one act of eating.
Yeah. Well, as we wrap up our lesson here, I think it'd be helpful to review some of the really important.
What about stones and stone altars? That's the last thing, and we got to find out about the last sentence.
Well, we don't. They're not to use dressed stones. That's true, and
stones
modesty,
as they are found may be used, because that's the way God made them. But you don't want to corrupt it by chiseling on it. Okay, so that's a restriction. Now, what about when you go up on the altar with steps, as some altars were? There is in Leviticus an instruction that priests going up on an altar must wear underpants. That's the first reference I know in history anywhere to underpants.
That's the fruit of the loom verse.
Yeah,
there, huh?
Right. Okay, go. Now let's summarize.
Well, we have some very important concepts here that we can draw out. The fear of God that we've talked about. In other words, reverence for God.
Yes.
Expressed in concrete acts of worship and sacrifice.
And obedience.
We've seen the concept of holiness with the separateness of the people. They stood at a distance. Yes. Big emphasis on obedience to God and to God's instruction. And then this wonderful emphasis on God's presence among His covenant people.
Yes. A covenant love that God is with us and not separate from us. Those are wonderful lessons, and they're still true, aren't they? And we're glad you could be with us, and we look forward to seeing you next week. We'll continue on with more about another covenant. So join us at that time, and may God's blessings be with you this week.
This has been In the Word, a study of the International Bible School lesson with Dr. Lee Magnus, Professor Emeritus of Bible from Milligan College, and Dr. Bill Gwaltney, Professor Emeritus of Bible of Milligan College. Join us again next week for another lesson from the International Bible School lesson text. This has been a production of the First Christian Church Television Ministries.